Good afternoon. My name is Jimmy Hale. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar that we've titled Demystifying Microservices. Happy afternoon to those of you in most of the country and late morning to those of you on the West Coast. We're going to get started today, and I am pleased and privileged to be joined by John Feldman, who is the Senior Director of Product Marketing at Skava, but I believe more importantly that I'm fortunate to consider John a friend of mine. So we're going to use today's webinar style to be a little more conversational, and we hope that'll be useful to you, and we hope it'll encourage you to interact with us as you enter questions during the course of the webinar in the chat screen there, and hopefully we're going to leave some time to get to those as we go through things today. So, by way of brief introduction, I am a senior consultant at Fit for Commerce. I have been in and around retail and e-commerce for an embarrassingly long time. I always say that when I started in e-commerce, Amazon was a bookstore. And, you know, we've seen tremendous growth across that time. I've been fortunate to work for retailers, for software providers, for agencies, as well as in the consulting space. So hopefully that kind of perspective and context will be useful today as we go through the course of this conversation on microservices, which clearly a very, very hot topic these days. So as I said, fortunate to be joined by John Feldman. John, why don't you give a little intro as well?
Yeah, no doubt, Jimmy. It is awesome to be talking to you and a pleasure to meet everybody on the webinar. My name is John Feldman, and I am, as Jimmy said, the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Skava. My history is actually pretty similar to Jimmy's. I've also worked at an agency, a consultancy, a software builder, as well as at I've run companies actually, or not run companies. I've participated in companies that have implemented this stuff. So really excited to talk about microservices. I know that, it's one of the things everybody's hearing about, but it's not super clear what they are. It's like, back in 2000, everything was a portal. Now everything's a microservice. So excited to be here with you today.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. Let me give you, to set the context, we thought we'd share just a slide or two about our respective companies that'll help you understand sort of where we're coming from. As I said, I'm with Fit for Commerce, and simply stated, Fit for Commerce is an advisor. We're a consulting organization that helps companies with business strategy, helps companies with technology strategy, helps companies with technology selection, evaluation, mapping those technologies to their overall business strategy. So in the course of doing that, we get to engage with a lot of clients, and hopefully it'll come out through this webinar. Some of those samplings of people that we talk to will be applicable to what we're talking about today. We operate under this notion of due diligence, and it's really more of a philosophy around helping customers make intentional strategic decisions, specifically when you think of something like technology. And as I said, mapping those technology decisions to your overall business strategy. In addition to that, we have an innovation office. One of the things that we're able to do, again, because of our relationship with companies like Skava, is look down the road and see what technologies are emerging. And I think even more importantly is understand how those technologies are being applied to solve business problems. So it's not just the technology itself, but really the application of that in your world that provides value. And we're pleased and fortunate to run the NRF Omnichannel Retail Index. And this is a benchmark of 120 retailers across their omnichannel capabilities, web, mobile, in-store capabilities, and it helps create an overall benchmark that companies can look and see, well, how do I stack up in these particular areas? So we go to market in a variety of different ways, and we're very fortunate to work with a large number of retail customers. If I can advance the slide, we'll help you. There we go. Sorry about that. Hundreds of retailers and hundreds of retail brands. It is a little known fact on a webinar. There must be at least one slide full of logos. There's another webinar requirement I'll get to in a minute, but we've checked off the first one. The first one is simply to show you a logo slide. I don't want to be facetious about this though. These are some tremendous numbers of brands, retailers across a number of in a number of industries where we have gone in and done strategic work, technology work. And for those of you on the webinar today, hopefully you see some of your names out there as well. John.
Yeah, let me tell you about Skava. So it's my pleasure to be joining you from Skava. We are the #1 microservices-based e-commerce platform right now. We have really taken a careful rethink of what an e-commerce platform is. And through the course of this webinar, hopefully you'll see some of the strategic advantages we feel we have in the e-commerce space in having a fully developed, completely robust and ready to go microservices architecture that you can implement your e-commerce store on. So we've got everything you need to build a store. It's wired already together, but if you want to break up our wiring and do it your own way, you can totally do that. We've been in this space, and we're 10 years old, and we are really excited to be riding the wave of microservices and e-commerce.
Great. Thanks, John. Let's look a little bit at what we're going to go through today. So this agenda slide, I don't want you to think about this necessarily in a purely linear way, but we are going to sort of in a conversational way walk through all of these topics. First, we need to set the stage. What are microservices versus the other approaches to architecture that you've heard about? Talk about sort of who is using microservices and how they're being applied. We're going to talk about the advantages and then how those apply to commerce. And then I think sort of an area where we'll talk around as well is trying to understand, is this the right architecture for you and your environment? How would you go about making that decision? And if so, how would we get started? How might you get started? So we're going to cover all of that. Our goal here is to leave some time for Q&A. We want to make sure that given a topic that's as hyped as this is and as popular as this is, we want to make sure we leave some time at the end for Q&A as well. So let's jump into it.
Let's do it.
So we're going to talk a little bit, let's talk a little bit about microservices, monolithic architectures, and service-oriented architectures. We're going to go all the way back to the 90s. Back to the 90s when this was, this was the best, I don't know if it was the best practice. It certainly was the only practice. Would you agree with that, John? It's sort of
oh, no doubt. I mean, this is back when Amazon was a bookstore, right? This was it. I think if you look at let's talk, right? Like what a monolithic platform is. Let's just find that out. So, back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, e-commerce was really becoming a big thing. I was at the time at ATG, and I remember that the fax machine just wouldn't stop ringing, and like order after order was coming in. And what we were selling at that point was ATG, which was a fully contained e-commerce stack. Right, you really you launched one application, the Dynamo application server fired up, then DBS on top and DCS, and you had everything running in one giant JVM in memory space. And that was at the time totally great. I mean, it was cutting edge. It got it done. I remember, we were able to fulfill the needs of pretty much any commerce shop that came in with that architecture. And there are, some great things about the monolith. It has a probably straightforward to implement. It's pretty zippy inside there, but one of the things which has been difficult about the monolith is that as e-commerce has evolved, obviously things have changed pretty dramatically since 2000. Customer expectations have increased. It's the idea that, hey, you have a mobile site isn't like, it's table stakes. You've got to have it. If you have physical stores, customers expect that they can order stuff online. The idea of you're going into a store that has registries and wish lists, that you'll be able to interact with that through the same system that is the e-commerce site, right? So the customers expect every touch point's wired together. And that has really proven pretty difficult for monoliths to keep up with. And again, it's just that they weren't designed, back when they were architected, there wasn't an expectation that they were going to have to be super flexible and super modular to be able to really support any sort of commerce experience anywhere.
I think that's an interesting point, John, is when we started this with this idea of the monolithic architectures, the key was we were looking at, it was in isolation. Every e-commerce, we were calling it then, was a silo. It was its own silo. So the idea that you had a singular end-to-end, front-to-back application controlling that was absolutely suitable. It was perfect for the time. And then as you
absolutely.
The business drivers and I think our philosophy of how to build these systems has evolved. I totally agree.
For sure. And
So,
I think that that's also because the ecosystem has really expanded. It's not just your e-commerce system soup to nuts. It's like, how does that e-commerce system fit in with order management, with front end capture? How does your entire enterprise fit together? It can't just be like one big thing.
well, let's look now. Let's step from there to the idea of microservices. And I think this is largely understood, but I would say in many ways, maybe misrepresented either intentionally or unintentionally. I mean, what I really like about the notion of microservices is not so much the technology, but the philosophy. This idea that we can create a business service that can be used across any of our current or future applications, and it can even be used by other parties. This idea of find a product or find a customer. Well, we can write that service and use it in a POS application. We can use it in a kiosk. We can use it in an e-commerce website. We can even let a trading partner use that service as one example. But it really stretches your mind on thinking about these things very differently than we used to think about sort of the end-to-end front-to-back architectures.
Absolutely. And it is, so if you're new to microservices, let's go through it. If you're familiar, we're going to go through it in a little bit. It won't take too long. But so from an architectural level, what a microservice is an application. So it runs in its own memory space, has its own database. But what it has are very robust in and out APIs that allow you to push data into it and pull data out of it. And so the idea behind a microservices architecture is that you build your solution with a combination of microservices. And so, I think that an order pipeline isn't a terrible way to think about it. If you think about any modern monolithic commerce package, it has an order pipeline. You get the thing, then you do tax on it, then you double check the cart's ready. Each little object does one action to the order object. Microservices takes this a really big step further, and rather than having the pipeline all live in the same application, they live as individual applications, right? So you have, if you're using the Skava model, you have a cart microservice, you have a search microservice. These are fairly decomposed business rules. And the goal is that if you want to make changes to one component of your system, you can do that through a single microservice, right? So if you want to change your catalog, or you're adding some item that has attributes that are novel to a SKU, you can make that change atomically in the catalog service. And then as long as it's adhering to the existing contracts in your APIs, you can still use all your other stuff. You don't have to pull the system down and do regression testing. You can push it out and see it go. And this has been, we'll talk about it in some depth as we get into it, but this has been a modern architecture we're seeing applied not just in e-commerce, but across wide verticals. Financial services has gone deep into microservices because it allows them to, chain together. Chain isn't the best way to think about it because it can be more of a cloud, but to put together series of little services to do very complex things in a way where one part of the system dies, not everything dies. So microservices. Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say that leads beautifully into why they matter. I think that's where you're naturally segueing to, is to talk a little bit about the importance of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Microservices do a lot of things for a business. And, I think that the two big highlights are flexibility and performance. From a flexibility standpoint, and this is going to be totally bananas if you aren't familiar with microservices, but if you look at some of the big users of microservices, Amazon is one of the biggest people out there who are driving microservices in their enterprise. They have, by their own count, hundreds of microservices. And they actually have different versions of the same microservice running. So they may have a catalog version of a microservice that serves one part of the site and a different catalog version that serves another. They're A/B testing microservices. Now, this is like the over-the-horizon dream, right? Like that's where you want to get. But the reason why I think you're seeing a lot of new technology companies taking a microservices approach is that it lets them be super flexible. They can make changes really quickly. Microservices lend themselves to a continuous integration, continuous development pipeline. So the whole goal is that you can pop these things out anytime you want without having to do a major deployment. On a monolithic system like the ones I've participated in the past, releasing code was no fun game. It took hours. You had to do a lot of regression before you got to that point. A deployment wasn't a sure thing. Microservices really seeks to turn that on its head by allowing you to flexibly push updates to individual microservices anytime you want without bringing the whole system down.
And I think the performance. Oh, go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, please. I was have one more thing on flexibility, then we can do performance. The other thing which is very flexible about them is that it allows you to build a solution to whatever your business solution is, right? Like, you can model your business solution in anything, but the goal in microservices is that once you've done it, you can use elements of it in other places. So if you write your shipping calculator and you know that, one of the things that your company can't do is send paint to some geography if you sell paint. Once that business logic is created, you can reuse that microservice in all of your future stuff. So from a flexibility and modularity, and you can buy microservices from anybody, so you can cobble together your own ecosystem. There's a lot of awesome stuff there. And then we can talk about performance, because there's
performance. Yeah, thank you. Is huge in my mind, because I remember back in the day. This is 2002, 3, 4, 5. Scalability was, we had to scale the entire application. So the investment in infrastructure was huge, and it was often, we were sort of held hostage by the worst performing part of the monolithic system. And so we would scale the entire monolithic system, multiple instances of it, when in today's world, in a microservices world, the singular service that is getting the most traffic, or that needs to be scaled the most, can be scaled out autonomously without having to invest in the infrastructure to scale the other parts or all of the other microservices. So you get not just autonomy in how you develop and how you build your systems together, how you release your code, but in how you drive performance as well. So
and that is
hugely important.
It's super hot, right? Because if, I'm sure many people on the call will relate to this. You've been in a situation where your application is non-performant, or there's a part of it which is just dragging down sales, or not going fast enough, and you can see that that's affecting the overall customer experience. And now if you have a monolith, you're like, man, I got to rack more servers, or if you're in the cloud, I got to spin up more instances, but you're spinning up complete copies of the application. And that is expensive and risky, right? It's a lot of work to do. You're racking servers. The advantage of microservices in a performance approach is that if it's your personalization microservice, which is just dragging everything down, the code isn't as great as you wanted, you don't have time to refactor it, it's absolutely positively got to be out in the wild working. You can, because the microservice for personalization is its own application sitting on top of its own database, you can scale that microservice, that component of your overall ecosystem, to take whatever load you need without putting a ton of horsepower behind, like your PIM system, which is performant already. That really lets you dial up and down your spend for hosting against what you're actually consuming. And one of the other things, just to say it explicitly, is that microservices let you host it on-premise. You can host Skava on-premise, you can host it in the cloud, you can host it in your own cloud. So you get a lot of flexibility in terms of how am I actually going to power this stuff. And again, the goal is to take you away from being like, I'm managing technology, and more towards, I want to be managing my business and being less concerned about, like, man, another $100,000 for a year of server, like, that's not the greatest.
Totally agree. So John, here's a good sort of a leading question. Didn't we accomplish this with service-oriented architectures? Kind of draw some parallels or some compare and contrast across this continuum. We've talked about both ends of the continuum. Talk a little bit about the middle here, this idea of service-oriented architectures that was the buzzword from, say, 3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And SOA is awesome, right? And it does a lot of really great things. And the way that I'll talk about SOA is, if you have WebSphere Commerce, they have put a really robust and super great API layer on top of the monolith. And that allows you to get into very deep parts of the application, and is a really great integration story. But it is really, I think, mostly an integration story, because the other two, the major advantages that we talked about microservices having, flexibility and performance, aren't addressed directly by SOA. On the performance side, you're still fundamentally running a monolith, right? And while you do have direct, ingress into the bowels of WebSphere or ATG or any of these monolithic applications, it doesn't allow you to rewire it, right? Like, you can overwrite the code, but you can't snap it together in a way that's going to make sense for you. So you don't get the same sort of low-level code flexibility that you would get, or integration flexibility between the microservices you get with microservices. The other is on the performance. Oh, go ahead, please.
Nope, no, please.
Yeah, on the SOA side for performance, it's the same story as the monolith, right? If you're having a problem in one of the sections of your application, even though you can access it over an API, which is totally great, you can't selectively scale that part of it. So SOA is a great thing for sure, but it doesn't address some of the great things that microservices do, from flexibility, scaling, as well as development methodology. It's a little bit trickier to do a continuous integration on a monolith. So
One of the things I've noticed, and call me out on this if you disagree. One of the things I've noticed about the term microservices is that either intentionally or unintentionally, it's been co-opted by sort of some of the software providers to be used, and they answer the question, are you microservices based, by saying, yes, we have APIs. And the two are very, very different things. And I think as a buyer beware, you want to press hard on that conversation. I think microservices in the purest sense is what we've been talking about, but you will in the industry, whether intentionally or unintentionally, you'll hear it used in a way that isn't really the right way. An API library is not a microservice. It can help drive an SOA, but it's not truly a microservice. Similar experience, John?
Oh yeah, totally. And it's not, I don't think anyone's being disingenuous, but I think it depends very much on what you want to get out of it. Because if it is, the reason why people are going to microservices in the pure form is that they want flexibility, they want the modularity, they want to be able to assemble their own ecosystem without having vendor lock-in. And all of that stuff is great, but it's really a question of what is it that I want for my business? What is the most important thing I need to buy? And if it is, my Hybris is going awesome, great, we've invested a lot of money in it, but what we really need to be able to do is, integrate in some novel payment product, like we want to go to Adyen or something, with our payment processor, that SOA layer is going to make it a lot easier. But if you're like, I want to actually do, I want to organize my microservices around delivery teams, I want to be able to push these things out anytime I want, you won't be able to accomplish that with an SOA architecture. So I think it's really important that you look at, like, what is it that I want to buy? Don't just buy microservices as a word, buy the technology to enable your business.
Absolutely. So let's do we'd love for those of you listening to let us know what you're doing. We're going to pop a poll onto the screen. If you've ever done this in a webinar, you always have to cross your fingers to make sure that it works. But here's today's poll question, really simply. Are you currently using or are you considering the use of microservices? So we'd love to hear where you guys are. And if you can just click one of these choices, the results will sort of be compiled as we go. We'd like you to pick among the following. You're currently using microservices. So right now, active, whether you've deployed them or not, but you're building and organizing yourself towards a microservices-based architecture. That's choice one. Choice two is you're seriously considering it. And then, of course, choice three is you simply aren't worrying about it right now. Bigger things to plan. This is good information for you, perhaps, but no plans to act on it. So if you would, live fire exercise, would love for you to take a few moments and click. We have no background music while this poll takes place. So in just a few moments, the results will pop up here. So we'll give you a second.
Hey, Jimmy, I didn't know that you and I could vote in this. That's no fun.
No, do we get to vote? I don't think we.
No, we can't.
We do,
I can't. Attendees only.
I know. Wow. So they don't want us to skew the results.
Yeah.
All right. So here we go, John. So this is kind of interesting. And I would say kind of what I would have predicted, about 17% currently using microservices. I think that tells us we're sort of in the early stages of adoption. Certainly when you go so far as to say people who have actively deployed, I would say, 1 in 5, that's a pretty good number. And then with a large majority considering to plan to use them. So together there, we've got 60% of the audience. And then 40% of you no plans yet. What strikes you when you look at this?
I think what's interesting is that I think it speaks a lot about the overall e-commerce market, right? Because we have, 83% of the group here that is using presumably monoliths or an SOA architecture.
Good point.
Right, and it's, just talking about microservices is really sort of the reason why I think where they're most appropriate and who gets the most benefit from them is that, I recently ran a big monolith at a large company, a billion-dollar e-commerce company. And one of the things that we struggled mightily with was trying to balance the amount of care and feeding and maintenance and just love that application took against actually doing innovation and fun new stuff. And, towards the end of it, we were finding that we were investing, and this is honest to God, we were investing for every $1 of new innovative stuff we built, we spent another dollar on just keeping the party going, keeping the application up.
Well, you were probably ahead of the curve then. So that's probably a low number compared across the industry. The technology debt is terrible.
It is. And it's, the reason I'm doing this is not to make anybody feel bad, but just to be like, hey, I think that this is a shared experience that a lot of people are encountering where it's like, wow, this is really hard. I'm not innovating. I'm just keeping the party going. And my business is like, why are you guys, what are you guys investing your time on? So it's, just to go back over why microservices can be a solution, or we haven't gone over it. Let's talk about why microservices can be a solution to that situation is really twofold. One is that because, so here's a concrete example. If you wanted to make a change to, so now you can sell paint in Massachusetts, right? Last year you couldn't, this year you could, awesome. The team that my experience tells me you're going to need to do that includes a person from your front end team, someone from order capture in the middle, your order management guys are going to have to get involved, maybe even a warehouse has to participate so that you can make sure that all the checks and everything that happens to make sure the paint is shipped to the appropriate geographies only are maintained, right? You got a lot of people in that room and it gets going. The dream of microservices is that the only place you're going to need to change that is within your shipping calculator microservice, because everything else will take that as a system of record, and you can make changes to that weird paint business logic without impacting the rest of your system. So right away, the goal is to make it so that if you want to make a change to your system, whether it be for something that's compliant like paint shipping, or you want to try some unique A/B testing, you don't need to get the entire chain in the room. You experiment in your microservice, and those are the only people you need, because so long as you don't break your API contracts place to place, you don't need everybody there. The other parts of the system are going to continue to get the data that they would, just now your shipping guys or your shipping microservice allows shipment to Massachusetts. And that,
I love that.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I love that. And maybe as we think about sort of how they're being used, and when you talked about team size, is that a good time for you to talk about the 2 pizza rule?
Yeah, totally.
I love the philosophy of breaking down these problems into, consumable and developing consumable solutions. And I've always found that to be a great metaphor, the 2 pizza rule.
Yeah, totally. So the 2 pizza rule is a really interesting one. So for those who aren't familiar with it, it's an idea that came out of Amazon, which is that you can't have a successful software team that can't be fed by more than 2 pizzas, right? So if you guys are like, we're working all night and we got to buy pizza for the team, if you need to buy more than 2 pizzas, then the idea is that team is too big. And that applies back through to the microservice teams, is that this, and I want to be careful here that this isn't something that you need to set up on day one for microservices. You can continue to do microservices in a waterfall methodology. You don't need to completely blow up and reorganize your development teams on day one. This is optional, but you do get a lot of bang for your buck on it. So as a forward-looking thing, as you move into more of a continuous development and agile development, if that's what the goals of your organization are, the 2 pizza team rule is that, hey, your personalization microservice shouldn't have more than 2 people's worth of people on it. Those people live there working on personalization. And the goal of that is that you limit the size of any one team building any components, but you don't need 40 people in the room to make a change. You can get, 4 people, 5 people in the room to make the change, and it happens faster. And ultimately, you serve your business better. That's the dream.
I think it's a great rule of thumb. Great rule of thumb. So let's segue a little bit, John, into sort of who is using microservices, and how.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is an interesting slide to look at, because if you look at the names that are up here, these are very large enterprises, right? I mean, very few people have the sort of traffic that Amazon has, right? Netflix has more data popping out of the system than anybody else in the entire universe. But what's interesting is that these are companies that aren't just retail. It's not just digital commerce. Twitter, Lyft, and Uber are companies that have also taken this architecture as the way to go. And again, the reason that they've chosen it, as we understand, is that it gives them this opportunity to have a lot of resilience in their systems. Netflix used to run this thing called a chaos monkey. And this is, I don't know if they still do it, but there was this idea that they actually ran an application that sat in their network and randomly shot microservices dead. And the idea of the chaos monkey was that how do we have resilience and depth so that we can lose parts of our infrastructure and yet the system can accommodate around it and still keep going. Amazon we talked about before, and we do have some detailed slides, but I think this is probably a good level to at least start the introduction with. Amazon, again, I mentioned, has hundreds and hundreds of microservices. They have different versions of the same microservices going. So at the very top end of the complexity scale, you can do a lot of crazy stuff. And, again, the reason for this, just looking at some of Walmart's numbers, is that the customer expectations around what commerce is are going to change. And, I looked at these numbers, there are a lot of people online. There are a lot of people getting online, and the amount of, if you think about sort of emerging markets and how, I'm always reading about how like Facebook and, people trying to move into India are like, we need to have a very small, slimmed down version of our application because data delivery is slow and you can't count on it. That's the way it was in the States 15 years ago. I remember my BlackBerry with WAP on it, right? Just to date me a little bit. That's not happening anymore. The expectation is that you're going to have these super beautiful, robust experiences. And so, the idea that, there's 5,200 gigabytes of data for every person on Earth should be like, wow, these systems are going to have to scale in a way which is different than they had to when the monoliths were architected. So,
I'm going to let you advance, John. Yeah, I'm going to let you.
Totally. Do it.
There was a lag earlier. There you go.
Yeah, this is the other rule of webinars, is that there will always be screen confusion and people being like, wait a second. Yeah.
There has to be chaos in the clicking. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, we got it. It's a full web experience. So I'll build the whole slide so you can look at it. So if you look at Walmart, right, the way that they began to move, and this is Walmart Canada in particular, is that, in 2005, they really only had a desktop and laptop target. And then by 2015, they were like, wow, everybody's reaching us in all of these different touch points. And yes, even games, now there is online shopping as part of, all, games for downloaded content, as well as just getting the stuff onto your computer. And as I look forward to 2020, the proliferation of these devices has exploded. And so by taking a microservices approach, the goal is, and you can see also on the right side, the number of services that they've built have increased as they start to offer a more robust web experience. This is how they're doing it. It's let's write the business logic one time and have it be able to address content on any device. Right? That is the dream. Yeah. So in 2012, they were having difficulties. And this is actually, I can't name the client, but I used to work for someone who was part of the team that changed one of the major retailers that was on one of the earlier slides from WCS to a microservices architecture. And he described that on Black Friday, the difficulty that they were having is that the volume of traffic that they were getting to their homepage was enough that it would topple the whole system over. And that was problematic, obviously, because for them, Black Friday was an important day, and bringing the whole site down for people just cruising their front page to see what the deals are was super problematic. So the following year, the change that they made was to actually, they didn't completely replace their system with microservices, but they knew that the biggest problem that they were having, why the system was falling over, was because the promotion engine wasn't able to handle the amount of traffic and doing the computational effort to figure out what promotions are appropriate for this person. They changed that to a microservice and were able to scale that through the roof, and they were able to stay up. And it's something we haven't talked about yet, but I want to slip it in here because I think now is a really good part for it. Is when you consider migrations and microservices, it's not. This is a big deal we should talk about because in my lifetime experience, when you think about switching platforms, it's like the third rail. I don't know if anyone on this call woke up this morning and was like, what's going to be the greatest idea? Let's totally replatform because that's a no problem. We'll do that in 6 weeks. The microservices architecture gives you an entry point to cohabiting with your monolith in a way that still allows you to move your business forward. And specifically what you can do is, because the microservices are atomic and have their own database and the ability to take data in and out, is that you can start wiring chunks of the functions of your monolith into microservices. So you can take really lightweight stuff and turn it into a microservice. Like, I'm going to take taxation, and that's going to be a microservice that sits outside. I'm going to take shipping calculation and have that be a microservice that sits to the side of my monolith. And why that's exciting is that you can begin to, you don't have to like get rid of your monolith on day one, right? Like if your monolith is 10 years old and you've got tons of investment and all sorts of business logic and stuff that's working to some degree in there that you don't want to throw out. So if you start doing it in pieces, then you can keep the parts of your business logic that you don't want to screw around with in your monolith longer and move parts where you want to invest and have innovation happen into your microservices.
I think that's a beautiful point, John. It's one of the aha moments for me was that this doesn't have to be, a big bang launch, doesn't have to be a major replatforming activity, that it can be a very gradual, or the speed is really up to the business, but it can be very gradual, calculated migration away from the monoliths towards the microservices. It's like you said, it's not you wake up today and say, let's blow up our system and rebuild it as microservices. I think it's
absolutely
a really compelling thing to grasp.
That other terrible spot is if you are in the midst of a migration, you're always faced with that terrible choice of, do I have to build this in two places? Because this new feature that everybody's hot on, am I going to build it into a platform I'm ultimately going to decommission and into the new platform I'm going to? With microservices, because you can have both running simultaneously, you can do your new development in microservices and not on your monolith and expose it all through APIs. So you're not doing double investment. Because I've been in that place where you're like, you can't move forward and you can't move back because you're supporting two systems which can't live together. And yeah, it can get pretty crazy.
Absolutely.
Let's see, let's go through. So I'm going to move beyond the slides, then we can talk about Amazon. Let's talk about Spotify actually first. So, one of the other interesting things which I'm seeing in the marketplace is that new technical entrants to the marketplace aren't encumbered by old platforms. And encumbered is a super strong word, so let me be careful about it. Like a lot of those platforms are doing awesome and making tons of money, but as new people enter into the space, they can take advantage of all the new thinking and all the new tooling that's out there without having to deal with their existing application. I think Spotify is a great example of that because they have been able to, through a microservices approach, really experiment and keep their platform pretty lively and open. And so, we have Ken Goldsmith here, a quote from him talking about because they've been doing microservices, it gives them tons of flexibility that they can kill stuff and bring stuff in. And for a business like Spotify, where they are a new player, although granted they're public now, this nimble ability to make changes to the platform was super important.
Well, that was the other thing. That was the other thing in addition to NASCAR slide is you have to say the word nimble or agile. So I thank you for doing that. But it's not to be facetious. It is these companies, certainly the new entrants, and I think the pressure on even retailers who've been in this space for years and years and years. The challenge is to innovate faster, and this is where that business agility. It's not agile necessarily in the development model sense. It's creating that business agility to go in different directions, zig and zag when you need to is important.
Yeah, and have the technology enable you to do that rather than be just friction, or not friction, but like have to really be considerate of what am I going to be able to do with this technology to allow this to happen.
Right.
Right. And then just the last one on Amazon. And Amazon is, we talked briefly about the idea of whether or not it's critical that you break your development team into two pizza teams right away. I think Amazon is a company that did completely shift the development software process. And this slide sort of talks about it, whereas when you have a monolithic development lifecycle, oftentimes what happens is you have one single bucket of changes into which you sort of pour everything your team's working on, you put it together, regress it, and then release it. We touched on this earlier, but sort of the beauty of microservices is that it's not one thing, it's a bunch of little things, it's a bunch of little applications. So each of them can be on its own build, test, release cycle, independent of one another. So that means that, if you have, if your company is changing its shipping table, and that's a super important change because we've got to goose sales for this quarter, you can isolate that work to the team that needs to do it rather than trying to figure out how you reschedule all the stuff which has flowed into your big release this month to make sure that the shipping stuff has priority. So you can see
John,
here at the bottom. Go ahead, please.
Oh, I was gonna piggyback on that because I think I want to piggyback on it and grab a question. I'm gonna harvest a question off the question list right now because I think it talks directly. The question is directly sort of the direction you're headed. We've talked about Amazon. We've talked about Spotify. We've talked about Walmart. These are massive corporations. And when we look at the slide and we talk about decomposing or reconstructing your software delivery teams, do you have thoughts on how this applies to perhaps companies that are smaller than Amazon, Walmart, and Spotify? Can this work at, a smaller, mid-sized company, or is this really just the domain for the major players? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a totally fair question. I think that microservices as architecture can benefit any size client, but I mean, super realistically, if you are a very small shop and you don't want to deal with development, you don't want to be sort of in the guts of what's going on, the microservices may not be your best choice. I mean, you do need a development team. You do need to be involved in the day-to-day development of what's going on. It suits businesses that are interested in making tons of changes, tons of very unique changes because their business rules are complex. But if you've got half a dozen SKUs and you are, doing $10 million a year, microservices might be pretty heavy unless there's something very unique about your business where you need that flexibility.
Right.
But yeah, certainly for medium and large business, this is a great unlock.
Perfect. I think that's a good segue into.
If you have more than 2 people in QA, microservices are probably something you want to take a look at.
That's a good way to look at it. That's another good rule of thumb. And I think that segues us right into some of the advantages.
Yeah, let's do it.
I think we've touched on some of this as well, and we told you guys we were going to be conversational as we go through this. So a little bit of this we've kind of touched on, but I think, John, it's great to kind of pull it all back together to look at the advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to advance these slides like a wild man.
There you go.
Well, there we go. All right. So I won't read the whole slide, but again, the major points are in a monolith. Each application is within the same memory, or each component, each object is in the same memory space as everything else. Whereas in microservices, they are their own applications. In monoliths, because everything's linked together, because I remember running monoliths, right? Like you touch one thing and then like something on the other side of the application would change. And you'd be like, how are these two things related? But if your code's 10 years old, weird stuff is related. So microservices helps ease that. It's an efficiency play and a speed to market play. And I think together those things are pretty strong. Sorry, I'm having slide advancement problems like they're going out of style.
There you go.
There we go. Awesome.
You're in California, and the presenter is in New Jersey, so we've got a transcontinental lag here.
Yeah, it's definitely happening. Whew, man, these are building slow. All right, so we talked about the key differentiators for microservices are, and I can't build through the slide for my life, so we'll just talk through it. There we go. Beautiful. Data independence. Each microservice has its own database, its own set of data. You access data from the other microservices via API. And so that means that you don't have a single database point of failure, that each microservice can be scaled and changed in a way where you don't have to talk to everybody else about what's going on. You can put as much horsepower as you need behind any microservice, and you can cycle them really fast, right? Because if I just want to touch on this because we've talked about it but haven't said it directly, right? One of the beauties of when you have a full microservices CI/CD pipeline going is that it's faster to fix in place. So if you have, if you release some code and something goes totally haywire, you're not in a situation where I got to roll this out of production and then figure out what I do to keep the party going. Instead, it's much faster to just fix it forward. I'm going to fix whatever this bug in this microservice is. I'll get my developer to do it. We'll run it through automated QA, and then we're going to pump that thing right into production. It's a much faster cycle rather than, oh man, all this comes back and then we got to untangle what's left.
And I think you touch on something there that's interesting. Is it impacts, the benefits are huge. The possible impacts are to how you architect, how you deliver, develop, QA, release management. All elements of the software delivery lifecycle fundamentally change for the better, I believe, but fundamentally change when you look at something, when you adopt a microservices model. And this is a good example of it right here in the order management example.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, you're decomposing, this, I think it's a great graphic because it shows everything sort of cohabiting inside the same application when you break it out into these pieces. And the way to think about the microservices on the right here is that each one of these is its own process. Each of these is running with its own database. And so, your order routing microservice is available all the time and can handle input from anyone that has a prepared order and figures out where to send it. So if you put a kiosk in a store somewhere, rather than having like, all right, I got to get kiosks because I got to sell stuff in stores, I'm going to go with, I found these agency, which is super smart at this. They've done it a million times, but because of the compressed time frame, the best I'm going to be able to do is have them like send me the orders at the end of the day, and I'll just dump out my SKUs to them at the beginning of the day, and magic will happen. Because you have all of these APIs, you can go to your agency and say, great, here's how we're going to provide you the SKUs. Here's our documented API, which we didn't have to build because this is the very same way that we pump data in and out of our own catalog. And here's where to push the orders into. Like, here's the order routing microservice, which will take data in this format and then finish the whole thing. And so rather than having this stood up kiosk system in stores, which is really decoupled from the existing monolithic application, you can provide a vendor which is going to build this kiosk system, your APIs, and they can wire it in to be part of the existing system. So yeah, there's a lot of benefit you get from this architecture.
So John, there's a question we had. I think this may be a good time for it. This is a question from the audience. It says, can you speak a little bit to how difficult it is to API enable a monolithic app? And then it looks sort of like the second half of the question is, it says, especially if the microservices are in a cloud and the monolith is on premise. So again, kind of mixing 2 points there, but the first part is API enabling a monolithic app. And I think what it really means is microservice enabling perhaps a monolithic app if the services are in the cloud and the monolith is on-prem. I think the short answer is it doesn't really matter, but love for you to opine on that for a moment if you could. Does that make sense?
No doubt. Yeah, totally. So it's, my personal opinion is that I wouldn't invest in building APIs onto a monolith in any depth unless it supports a very specific integration goal that you have. I think that you're better off setting a microservice off, whether it's hosted in the cloud or on your premise, and then wiring that into your monolith through existing APIs. In terms of the on-premise hosting in the cloud thing, this is something that I think is a little scary for some people, because it does mean that not everything is going to be hosted physically right next to everything. It's not, my whole system runs on this server and I know it's good, and I've got 4 Xenons in it and everything's hot. You will end up in a situation where you're going to have to transit the network to go and find out information, which, while it can introduce latency, I'm not going to pretend there's not latency associated with that. If you architect it carefully, it can be managed so that it doesn't present a customer impact. And the other thing which I would point out is that we're moving this way, even in a monolithic application. If that's your architecture, we're moving towards having external systems. You probably, if you're listening, have an external payment processor. You probably have an external fraud check. That's probably planting pixels and trying to figure out whether or not the transactions are correct or not. So it's, these ecosystems are expanding anyways, and I would encourage you not to get hung up on the, man, my monolith is hosted in Sacramento, but now I'm going to set up a bunch of these microservices in the cloud, AWS US West. Like, that is something which people do. It is the correct architecture. You just have to do it in a way that you have VPNs between the cloud and you have it between your hosted facility. But yeah, it's the way it goes.
And I think that you touch on a great point there, which ties back to some of the earlier delivery conversations we were having, is the idea of start small. So you're jumping a number of hurdles simultaneously. You're looking at how your teams are built. You're looking at how you architect differently, but that also extends into how you deploy. So taking a very simple microservice, separating it from your monolithic app, putting that in the cloud is a good way to exercise sort of all of this. You build some muscle as you go. You refine your approach, and you kind of learn how this works best. You learn, is latency a problem? You learn where you may have to have multiple instances of the service running. So I think if there's any, one of the big takeaways here is that idea of starting small, evolving slowly, especially if you come from a history of self-contained, self-hosted, very large monolithic apps. You want to prove it to yourself. You want to prove it to your business owners that you're not putting things at risk. And I think that's one thing that comes to mind when we were talking about that question.
Oh, for sure. And I think another reason, and it's not that like they're broken boats and dead bodies on the shore, right? It's just you want to make sure you're doing it in a slow and or in a carefully considered way. One of the mistakes I've seen people make when they go into a microservices architecture is some of the first things that they try to model and replace in a microservices architecture is some of their most complex, thorny, most used business logic. I remember that I was at a company and they were like, the very first microservice we're going to build is one that calculates how long it's going to take for something, or like when the delivery date of an object is going to be, which is used on every web page throughout the entire site, on every screen of the order management system, in every planning tool. And the problem is to start with what should have been a very straightforward technical solution, right? Type in a SKU, here's the data pops out. You ended up with 50 people in the room, with everybody who has an agenda and a schedule and stuff that they need to get done. And it's very hard to do that. I think that, to Jimmy's point, your first microservice is less about what it does and more about proving the point and building infrastructure so that your second microservice can be much more complex and build on the shoulders of your first one. So I would encourage, as you look at experimenting with microservices, start small. I mean, don't not be ambitious. You should still be ambitious, but just make sure that your first one's going to be a success. It's really important to start on a strong note and be realistic about how much you're going to be able to accomplish on the first one.
Yeah, I've also found that engaging, business users in this idea of microservices, they've heard those of us who come at this from the technology background. We always have yet another way that we're going to revolutionize software development. Right? We've been saying this for a long time. There's always the next new thing. So I think it's less to the business user, less about the hype and the approach and the value of microservices, and much more about demonstrating to them your ability to evolve different pieces of your application separately, your ability to move things into production without waiting for the large release. They're looking for the proof. They want to see the results. They're less enamored with, a conversation around the philosophical value of microservices. And I think that ties back to the idea of starting small, starting slow, so that you can demonstrate some of those things to them. The first time they hear that you're going to release some code in the middle of the day and not wait till 2 a.m. on Tuesday morning, they're really going to be happy. So I think that's the way you win them over. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. And it is, I want to underscore that, because it's like, this is the year that Bluetooth is finally going to get worked out, right? Like we've heard that since 1993. It's important that it's not technology for technology's sake. I mean, one of the things which is exciting about microservices is that this is a technology that actually allows development organizations to more nimbly do what their businesses want. I mean, this was developed as an answer to the, wow, there's a lot of friction in my monolithic application. How can I do this better question? But don't just do it because it's a buzzword, right? Like a buzzword's not going to solve anything, but doing a deliberate approach and taking a carefully considered approach to it, I mean, you can get a lot of mileage out of it. It's very exciting stuff.
We are nearing the end. We've worked in a couple of questions as we go, John. I think there's only a couple of more slides that we have roughly summarized. Sort of this slide here, that the next one on how do you understand if microservices are appropriate for your organization? We had a couple of examples, but I think we've talked through a few of those, and we may want to jump sort of to the idea of, are microservices a good fit for you? And then I think we touched a little bit on how to get started, but maybe that's a good place to kind of bring the webinar to a close.
Yeah, totally. I'm clicking like a madman here, but so
you're close. You're close.
I'm getting there. Our microservices for you. So again, it's not, if you have a fully outsourced e-commerce solution and that's working great for you, right? If your relationship with your online store is working out great in a hosted environment, this is probably not a great solution for you, because you're going to have to be sort of like a development shop to make this work, which isn't, I think, materially different than any other big e-commerce solutions which you host on premise. But it is like, you want to make sure you are ready to go. And the other is that there is, potentially you could end up with a lot of these microservices. So there is a secondary overhead of making sure that you know what you're deploying and why. Again, all of that's manageable, but if that's not the sort of headache you're interested in because, Shopify's getting it done for you, 2 thumbs up. But if you are a business person who's frustrated that you're not able to get the flow out of your IT organization that you want, or you're an IT professional who's like, I really wish I could do more, but I'm spending a lot of time like fighting with database errors, this is something you should look at, because this is really, this relieves some of those crises. And again, to get started, we talked earlier about implementing a strangler pattern. That's the idea that you slowly take pieces out of your monolith as the noose around it gets tighter, and eventually everything in the microservices architecture, your monolith is freestanding. Again, there are a million different ways to approach that, but the key is that you can build it around what makes the most sense for your business. Target the stuff which is going to be the most impactful after you've got your microservices base going, and then put those into microservices and reduce the development effort it's going to take to keep your monolith going. And again, you're chipping away at the core of that legacy system without turning it off, because everybody's got code in there that was difficult to build and you don't want to touch. So, yeah.
Great point. And I think that gets us just about to the end. John, I want to thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. It's great partnering with you on this. I think this is a fascinating topic. I feel like we both covered a lot of ground and at the same time only scratched the surface. So maybe we can get back together and dive a little deeper on this. I want to thank all of you who participated. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest. And we hope you have a great afternoon.